Welcome everybody. The we are starting this event tonight. This is just going to wait for see how we count the people coming up. We'll give this a couple minutes to get everybody populated in here. As we're going, my name is Steve Sammons. I'm the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives here at Corbin University. And we're hosting this year's World Outreach Week. And I'd like to welcome our guests. We've got over 400 people registered for this event. And our IT department sent me a note a little bit ago that said over 10% of the guests for tonight's event are from outside the country. We have people from the Philippines to Malaysia. We got one from Madagascar, Chile to the Netherlands. It's truly a worldwide event. Let me tell you a little bit about Corbin University before we get into here. Corbin is nestled in the forested hills of Oregon, just outside of the state's capital of Salem. We're about an hour south of Portland. And we have the distinction to be in the part of the country that's known as the most unchurched part in the United States. Matter of fact, as opposed to being nestled in the Bible Belt, the area is actually called the Unbible Belt. Corbin's mission is to educate Christians who will make a difference in the world for Jesus Christ. And Corbin's been at that for 85 years. Our guest this evening is Professor and author Dr. Darrell Bock. Dr. Bock is the Executive Director of Cultural Engagement and a Senior Research Fellow Professor of New York New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Bock's new book, which just released on the 15th of September, is entitled Cultural Intelligence, Living for God in a Diverse and Pluralistic World. But before we get into this, let me take a moment and let everybody know a little bit more about who we have the privilege of spending the evening with. Dr. Bock earned his recognition as a Humboldt Scholar. Dr. Bock, how do you pronounce the town that you were in?
Tübingen.
Yeah, thank you. That's a tough word for me to get.
There we go.
He's the author of over 40 books, including well-regarded commentaries on the book of Acts and Luke, and studies of the historical Jesus. He loves to go to Israel and lead tours and talk about historical Jesus within Palestine. He's also the host of Dallas Theological Seminary's Table Podcast. He was the president of the Evangelical Theological Society. He's a consulting editor for Christianity Today and serves on the boards of Wheaton College and Chosen People Ministries. He's written articles for a host of leading publications and is certainly an expert for the general media on New Testament issues. Now, Dr. Bock is a New York Times best-selling author. And when Dan Brown wrote the Da Vinci Code, Dr. Bock responded by writing a New York Times best-selling book, Breaking the Da Vinci Code. Answers to questions everyone's asking. Prior to this presidential election, he wrote a book called How Would Jesus Vote? Do Your Political Views Align with the Bible? He's been married for over 40 years to Sally, is the proud father of 2 daughters, a son and a grandfather. Dr. Bock, welcome to Corbin University. Welcome to World Outreach Week.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, although I will say I have not even had to cross a red light to visit you tonight, which is amazing. Normally I'd get on a plane and it'd take me a while to get from the Bible Belt to the unBible Belt, and it would be a real issue. And you know, it's great. It's great to be able to connect with you and to have this conversation.
This is an honor and pleasure, and I've had the chance to read the book, and I highly recommend this book. So this is going to be a joy to discuss this tonight. The format of this evening, we're going to go through and discuss the book for a little while and leave a good portion of tonight for a chance for any of you to ask questions of Dr. Bock. And that'll be done with the question and answer section on the website. So feel free, you can start asking those as we go through, and we'll get to them as we have a chance. So let's get started. We kind of want to understand, why is it you wrote a book entitled Cultural Intelligence at a time like this, and exactly what culture are you referring to?
Well, I wrote the book because I honestly think the church has been misguided in the way it's undertaken the culture war and the way in which it's engaged. And I think it's biblically flawed. Having said that, I wanted to write a little prologue on a little theology of cultural engagement, which I actually don't think exists. And because of my role at the seminary as executive director of cultural engagement, I've spent a lot of time working in this area, thinking through it biblically. So I wanted to do that. And then very early on in the book, I make the point that really the name culture is a misnomer, that there's no such thing as a singular culture, although we use the term that way all the time, that actually what you have are cultures, subcultures that rub against each other like plate tectonics. Now, when I talk to someone who lives on the West Coast, I know you understand the dynamics of plate tectonics and what that means either for earthquakes or volcanoes. And so when they rub against each other like this, there's pressure that exists in the way our culture functions. And the shift in my lifetime from a country that was really surrounded by a Judeo-Christian net to a country that has lost that net for the most part, even in the South where I live, that net is not what it used to be, means that there is an adjustment that the church has to make in how it engages with people and what they can assume about the way in which they engage. And so the book was written out of the concern for that shift on the one hand, and the fact that the way we were going about it, I didn't think reflected the commitments of the gospel on the other.
That's great. And in the book, you discuss the idea that there's this perspective or an ideal within the Christian community that we're fighting to win a battle on multiple fronts. And therefore, there has to be confrontation with the goal of taking over culture. Can you expand on the idea that there might be a different goal in mind?
Yeah, this is where part of the error comes in. Our assignment is not to take over the world. Never has been, never will be. The only person who's going to fix the world is Jesus Christ when he comes back. Our assignment is to represent God in the midst of the world as those who have a citizenship in heaven, as those who are ambassadors for God, as those who are, how can I say this, exiles in a foreign land, however, whatever metaphor you want to use. And so that means that we're inviting people out of a secular space, out of a worldly space, into the community that enables people to live with the Spirit of God inside them because of the forgiveness that they receive, which is at the core of the gospel. You don't fix the society around you without fixing the hearts of the people that are dealing with. The Old Testament gives us an illustration of having a wonderful lawgiver and good laws, but bad hearts. And the lesson of the Old Testament is that's a mess. So we got the new covenant to put the Spirit of God inside of people, to understand the context of a life living out of grace and forgiveness and mercy. And that is those are the core Christian values that we're supposed to be engaged with and showing. Now, there is a confrontation. I spend a lot of time talking about this. There is a confrontation, a spiritual battle. But the text in Ephesians 6:12 says, our battle is not, that's emphatic, against blood and flesh, against people. People are not the enemy. They're actually the goal. The Great Commission says we're supposed to go into the world and make disciples. It doesn't say we're to go into the church and make disciples. And so we're supposed to go out into the world and challenge people. And the way we do it, the spiritual battle is against cosmic forces and principalities and powers. One of the Greek words is the word cosmocrat. And I say, if you think a bureaucrat is bad, you should meet a cosmocrat. And this is a spiritual battle that we're engaged in. And the resources, the armor that defends the territory that God has already won for us is our lived out faith. So it's righteousness, it's feet shod with the gospel, it's the Holy Spirit, it's prayer, it's the word of God. And when we live out our faith, not only declare it, but live it out relationally as well. Follow through on the great commandment, those kinds of things. That's our best defense, what's going on around us. The armor is not political ideology. The armor is not the circumstances that I find myself in. The armor is the core of our faith and the lived out nature of our faith. And that's where the misdirection, I think, comes. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't confrontation. There is. And there aren't ideas to contend for. They are. But the place where you see those ideas where you're supposed to see those ideas most effectively engaged and reflected is within the community that has been, where people have been given the capability to live in a way that honors God. That's why the gospel is so important to this conversation, even though you're in engagement. We've separated social gospel and gospel in such a way in which both the left and the right have bought into a bad deal. And that is that those two things are separate and distinct. Liberals came along and said, we'll do the social gospel and we'll forget about the biblical gospel. Conservatives came along and said, we like that deal, but we'll opt for the biblical gospel. And we separated something that actually belonged together, because if I live out the gospel, that's supposed to actually connect to the way I relate to people, in the way in which I engage with people, whether they're in the faith or outside the faith. That's what I'm contending for.
Yeah, wow. That it's a different game, different goal.
Different game entirely. Yep.
Yeah. Speaking of game, you do such a great job in a book and introducing some new terms. One of them was the GIA. At least it was new for me.
Yeah.
You got the MI6 in the UK. You've got the CIA in DC, and then you get the GIA in this book. So, what's the GIA?
The GIA is, I tell people, if you want a military metaphor, here's the military metaphor. Rather than thinking about yourself as an army that's supposed to crush people who disagree with you and defeat them, which is the way we generally form the culture war, we actually need to think about being members of God's intelligence agency, or be member of special forces. Now, what does special forces do? Special forces goes in and rescues someone who's in danger. But here's the trick. The trick is that the core of the way people are trapped involves a delusion. And the delusion is that the person that you're trying to rescue doesn't even recognize they're in danger. They don't even recognize that they're trapped in a misreading of life. It makes all the difference in the world whether I think the person who's disagreeing with me and sitting across from the table is someone to be crushed, or is the goal, and the goal is a form of rescue in trying to make them aware of the delusion. And one of the ways the delusion works is that you don't even see the opponent, okay? You can't sense that they're there. And in fact, for some people, they aren't there, which is part of the way it works. And so my point is, you need to engage in a way that you're actually trying to rescue people who are in need. In fact, you've been where they've been. And in the midst of understanding that, there should be some sympathy for what their need actually is, even in the midst of their disagreeing with you. And so the GIA are those special forces who've been given that assignment. They are the people who've been assigned the Great Commission, whose goal is to go into the world and make disciples, which means I'm going to constantly be in the tension whenever I offer the gospel between the challenge that the gospel offers to people and the invitation that this is actually good news that we need to respond to, and that there's something positive that's being offered to people. And what I often say to people about that is, it makes all the difference in the world whether your gospel comes from Genesis 3, starting in Genesis 3, or starting in Genesis 1. Genesis 1, the gospel is the idea of we've been made in the image of God, we've been made for life in fellowship with God, and our life has purpose because he's made us in his image. We start there. And the gospel is the recovery of what was lost at Genesis 3, but the goal isn't merely to forgive my sins. The goal is to pull me back into that relationship with God that makes sense out of life. That's pulling the gospel back from Genesis 3 to Genesis 1. That's the good news, is that can happen, and that God restores that in the offer of the gospel, because he not only forgives our sins, he gives us his spirit so that we're able to fellowship with him as a result. And sometimes the gospel is presented as if it's escaping a place or escaping a fate. It's basically replacing a negative. And my statement is, the gospel's a positive. It's not about avoiding a place. It's about gaining a relationship with the Creator God. And that's the most important thing we can do. So this challenge and invitation are both there. And if it's all challenge and no invitation, you never sense that it's good news. If it's just invitation and no challenge, you haven't explained why it's necessary. So you got to have them both, and you got to keep them in tension.
And I just love that God's intelligence agency, and just the term itself starts conversations.
That's right.
It's great. Now, there's a part in the book, a major point that you make in the book that really, for me, I had to slow down to come back at this thing, is that there's this common approach that Christians have when they're discussing ethical issues. that the ethical issue is true because it's in the Bible. And you face a challenge to us to reframe our thinking in a different way, that it's in the Bible because it's true, or God put it in the Bible because it's true. I'd love for you to help slow down and expand on that thought.
Okay, this is precisely where the shift in what's going on around us is important. Because it used to be, because we had the Judeo-Christian net around us, people regarded the Bible highly and thought the Bible, even if they didn't believe the Bible is the Word of God, the Bible is at least a respected text. Okay, it's got religious wisdom in it or whatever. Think about how someone on the outside of the faith might think about it in positive terms. Of course, that's no longer true, and that's no longer a given. So how do you make the point without giving up the Bible? That's the point. And the point is, you don't make the Bible an imprimatur, okay, where you put the stamp of the Bible and that makes it true. Because for the person who doesn't have a high regard for the Bible, that point doesn't score any points, okay? It just goes nowhere. So how do you do it? You do it by thinking through, God put this in the Bible because it's true. It's about an authentic way to live life. That's what he's telling you. In fact, that's the point of inspiration. The point of inspiration is not the Bible. The point of inspiration is what the Bible teaches. Okay? Now, that's harder work for us, because now we have to ask the question, why would God say this is an authentic way to live? Why would God say this is a true way to go about life? And that requires a little more work on our part. Okay? We have to be a little more robust in how we think about the ideas the Bible presents. But when we do that and do that well, we've actually begun to present to people why the Bible says what it does. And if you do that enough and the person says, you know, that sounds pretty wise. Where'd you get that from? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. That's what the Bible is teaching. And I come at the Bible through the back door, but I come at its truth directly, undergirding what it's saying. So I say to people, it's not true because it's in the Bible, although that is true. It's in the Bible because it's true, because that's actually what inspiration was supposed to be about, to tell us the true way to live.
But it's interesting. It's so common that we continually need to catch ourselves. Have we changed how we're approaching?
Yes, and if you think about Mars Hill, the example that I have in the book is, think about Mars Hill. When Jesus, or Paul for that matter, or Peter, are preaching to people who know the Bible and respect the Bible, they cite the Bible. But when they go to Mars Hill, the people don't know schmatz about the Bible. They don't know Genesis from Malachi. They have no idea what that book is about. They tell a biblical truth story, but then they cite Greek poets to make the point. And I often challenge my students. I said, if you had to make a biblical point but had to cite someone out of the culture who's wrestling with the reality of life to do it, could you do that? Could you take lyrics? Could you take literature and that kind of thing, where a person's asking really sincere questions about life and making a point that goes in a biblical direction, be able to recognize that and make that point to someone else to have a conversation with them about what it is that you're talking about. I think it's a very effective way to think about how to apply what we're talking about.
But it's interesting in the just focus on intelligence, cultural intelligence, knowing what's gone. You dedicated an entire chapter on Paul's approach as he was taking the intelligence he had and applying it back to the community that he was witnessing to. Unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, well, this is the second chapter, of course. And what I do first is I go through and I say, here's Paul's description of the culture in Romans 1. If you read Romans 1, I sit there, whenever I read Romans 1, I go, you know, Paul's pretty amazing for a first century guy, because he's been watching our 10 o'clock news. You know, what he's describing is what I see all around me. You know, here I am 21 centuries after Paul, and the same stuff is going on. And he has a view about culture, and it isn't very flattering. I say it's a technical theological term. It's the term yuck. You know, I joke with our systematic theology department, we ought to teach a course in yuckology, the study of yuck. And all you have to do is look at some of the stuff that goes on in our culture. He has a negative view of culture and the impact of idolatry, making man the center of the universe. That's what that chapter is all about. And when you go to Acts 17, we see how he speaks to that culture. He speaks to that culture so differently that liberals say that can't be the same person. And what's really interesting is that when you take a look at that chapter, you sit there and you go, the moment you make that move and deny the connection between the two portraits of Paul, you've actually missed the lesson. Because that text begins by saying he walked around Athens and he was provoked by all the idols. If you go to Athens today, you'll see idols everywhere in the museums. So you can sense what Paul is talking about. And he begins that speech by saying, to this audience, I sense that you are very religious. Now, I'm a child of the 60s. So when I read that verse, I go, Paul, what have you been smoking? How in the world could you make that remark to that audience, given what you think about that culture? And what he's trying to do, he's trying to come at them from where they are starting. He's not thinking about where he is or just where he is. He's thinking about where they're starting from. And so he says, I'm going to feel like you pursue spiritual things, you pursue religious things. Let's have that discussion. I'd love to be on that floor. And the ancient world was full of religious activity. They had 150 religious holidays every year that you celebrate. That's a holiday every 3 days. We need to adopt that calendar. And so in the midst of thinking about that, you know, I sit there. But what he does is he says what Greg Kunkel in a book called Tactics, which is a brilliant book, says at one point, you need to put a rock in someone's shoe. A rock in someone's shoe is, you know, when you get a rock in your shoe and it just irritates you and you take a step and you're shaking your foot trying to get the rock in a place where you can, and finally you just give up. You pull off the shoe, you pull the rock out of the shoe, you put it back on, and now you're comfortable again. So the rock in the shoe is giving someone pause about where they are sitting and what they are thinking by putting something that a thought that they just can't shake, if you will. That's what Paul's doing in that speech in Mars Hill. He says, you think idols are the way to live your life? Do you think you can contain the Creator God? And he just raises some questions for them to ponder, you know, ponder anew what the Almighty could do. And in the midst of doing that, he lays it out. So we see Paul engaging in a way that is sensitive to where his audience is coming from, and then builds steps one at a time to pull them in the direction towards the gospel, as opposed to doing a full gospel dump at the start. And when he gets to his core points, he's not citing Bible verses, he's citing their poets to draw them in that direction at the same time, but he's telling a biblical story as he does it.
That's awesome. Now, we had the contrast of it's true in the Bible, or God put it in the Bible because it's true. You've got another contrasting thought that you explain actually in quite great detail in the book, and that's how we approach Scripture. How are we walking into it? Are we stepping into our understanding of the Bible with our life experiences, hanging on to them hard, looking for alignment, or are we taking the Bible and having it influence our life experiences? Can you walk through the logic in this line of reasoning?
Now, this is the last chapter, and this was really written for seminaries and Bible colleges and Christian institutions, in which I argue that both approaches are important, but we tend to only do one of them. And this is how I set it up. Most schools are set up to teach you how to handle the Bible, and then you think about the application to your life. Okay? Almost all exposition works that way. All our exegesis works that way. Our theological work works that way. Let's start with what the Bible teaches and see how our life aligns to it. My premise is that most people read the Bible in the reverse direction. They go to the Bible looking for God's wisdom for sure, but they're thinking about their life situation and particular circumstances that they're dealing with, very specific kinds of questions that they tend to read the Bible with out of their life experience. And they're looking for help from the Bible to get there. So they start with the Bible, start with their life and go back to the Bible. And I'm arguing that we who teach need to be able to switch hit. We need to be able to go both ways. We need to take the scenarios of life as it is in a fallen world and look at that biblically. But it doesn't come biblically a passage at a time when you read the Bible that way. That's a canonical way to read the Scripture. So let me take for a quick example, money. If you read about money in the book of Proverbs, there are a lot of positive things said about money, about the blessing that it is, the opportunity that it creates, the need to steward it well, that's what wisdom literature does with money. You read Jesus in the Gospels, he has a lot of negative things to say about the danger of the pursuit of money. So biblically, when you put that together, you've got kind of positive angles on the thing and some questionable, challenging angles on the thing. And if you are, I like to say it this way, if you're a Solomonic person on money, you're going to have one attitude. If you're a Jesus person on money, you might have another attitude. But the biblical approach, which is canonical and works from life back to the Bible, takes the whole of that and says, here are the things that money can do for you. Here are the things where money is a danger. And you've got to have all that in view as you think about it. So the danger of exposition, if I can say it that way, is that it puts blinders on us or risks doing so by giving us only one passage or one angle on a topic that actually the Bible usually talks about through its whole from many different angles that we have to put more together. It's a harder way to read the text, but it's an important way to read the text because we all live in a fallen world, and much of what I deal with in the book deals with the clash of values that life in the fallen world foists upon us that causes us to make judgments about balance as opposed to cherry picking between this value or that value, which is what happens in our public square discussions oftentimes. We don't see the clash, we don't acknowledge the clash, we don't wrestle with the balance, we pick one value and negate or try and minimize the other, and we don't acknowledge that we live in a fallen world where this clash exists well enough to think through what that balance might look like.
And the public square, when you wrote the book, the public square shifted between the time you finished and delivered the manuscript until the time, September 15th, when it came out. And
that's very, very true. In fact, almost all the stuff, when I do these lectures, when I go around and do these lectures on weekends in churches, what often happens is I sit there and the first lecture I go through and I say, I want to just declare to you how much has shifted in my own lifetime. Just to have, because the world is both bigger and smaller simultaneously. And what I mean by that is there are more people and we're more aware of each other than we've ever been, because in a communication world, we're all connected in a way that we weren't connected before. And there's access to all kinds of things instantly that didn't instantly exist. In my lifetime, it's in my lifetime. There was a time in my lifetime when you could not have a live communication between the United States and Europe. Okay, that couldn't happen. You know, we had a thing called the telegraph, okay, or the telephone, okay. You could make a long distance call, but you couldn't send a visual signal from one continent to another. Think about how often that happens today, in contrast.
we have Madagascar on this land right now.
Exactly right. So you've got this bigger and smaller world simultaneously. That's why there's no going back. We live in we are immersed in a diverse world. And so the church is having to cope with that diversity in the midst of what's going on. So part of the book is about how to do that.
That's great. You speak about tribalism. You actually say it's killing us right now. You made a broad sweeping criticism, but there are Christians out there that feel that if we give any ground, if we compromise at all, it's dangerous and it's inappropriate. Can you speak to this tribalism and what you meant by that?
Well, the tribalism is part of what creates the separation, which actually drives me away from the Great Commission if I'm not careful, because I make people the enemy, okay, rather than the goal if I'm not careful. Now, there are ideas to contend for, but the other reality is that our protection is our lived out faith in the context of our communities, okay? The world is going to be a messy place. Even our communities are going to be a messy place. They're hopefully less messy than what's going on in the world. That's part of what the hope is of the testimony and the contrast. So yes, there are ideas out there that are dangerous. There are ideas that are out there that are destructive. There are ideas that are out there that you contend for. But Jesus told his disciples, if you represent me well, the world will push back on you. Jesus did not call us to win territory. He did call us to challenge hearts and to win hearts. And he did call us to be faithful in the way in which we live in such a way that that contrast becomes clear. He called us to be light, okay? But that means I might lose in one sense. I tell people, you know, Jesus did everything right. He still ended up on a cross. So we need to, he spent the second half of his entire ministry telling his disciples, this is the way it's going to be. You're going to have to bear a cross daily. So I may not win these battles of ideas that take place. But hopefully what I don't lose is the importance of my character in the midst of that, and the importance of the community's character in the midst of that. Because that, without that integrity, we become no different than anybody else.
In the book, you talk about things that bring conversations down. You talk about things that bring conversations up, and you discuss several of those. But one of them you named exorcism.
Yes.
Besides being a tantalizing topic, what do you mean by exorcism?
Exorcism is the use of labels to avoid conversations of substance. Okay. And it's an equal opportunity employer. The left and the right both do it. So if I go liberal, okay, be healed, liberal, that's liberal, or conservative, be healed, or Marxist, okay, or fundamentalist, I can't make an F with my hands. I guess the closest thing I can do is about that. Anyway, that we all do it. In fact, you see it on television every 10 seconds on the news channels. Here's what it's an attempt to do. You label it, you play taps over it, and then you bury it, okay? Because it's a conversation avoider. It doesn't get down into the substance of what's going on. It doesn't allow for a conversation. It's dismissive. It also can be disrespectful sometimes. So there are lots of things that go into the use of the labels, and it's a form of exorcism. It's a way of bringing a conversation to a halt by labeling someone, rather than looking at the particulars that might show that it's true. The charge may be true, but you never get down and dirty in the conversation, because your label is an attempt not to go there.
But it's easy to see we do live in this 10-second soundbite, 30-second soundbite. We want to simplify everything. Speak to that as far as we become culturally intelligent. How do you handle that?
I call it slow thinking. Okay, it's slow thinking. It's against most of the problems that we've created have taken years and sometimes centuries to create. Race, for example, the situation we're in on race. You really think we can solve it in what I call 30 minutes with 2 commercial breaks? Probably not. So it's slow thinking. It's actually wrestling with how problems work. And I have 3 templates for how problems work. And the bulk of them belong in cases where values are colliding. And the issue is, how do I balance these concerns, as I've said, versus choosing between one or the other? So on race, I mean, just think about it. There's the issue of injustice. And today, the issue of race is pitted against the idea of law and order. Okay. Who doesn't want to have an orderly society? Who doesn't want people to follow the laws on the one hand? Okay. But what are we going to do about injustice on the other? And when I read Isaiah 1 or Amos 5 or Micah 6, and God says to his people at the time, I don't care about your worship if you don't care about justice. Okay, that's a pretty serious indictment about what it is that God calls us. So I probably ought to be concerned about justice on the one hand, but I've got to be concerned about orderliness on the other. So how do you balance those two things? And when our political parties make us choose between the two, okay, I'm going to elevate one and demote the other, or vice versa, we actually rob ourselves of the political and public discourse we need to have. And that is, how do you balance these two things? What should be the relationship between them, and how do we pursue them best? That kind of thing. Acknowledging that each side is presenting a value that needs attention and needs to be respected, and yet at the same time wrestle with, okay, so how do we make this work in a way that orders our society on the one hand, and that also respects the lack of, the discrimination that sometimes happens in certain contexts when it comes to race. Because it's the anger that drives the reaction on the one hand, and the frustration that comes out of that. And then we get into a cycle. I heard George Yancey, African-American sociologist, teaches at Baylor, talk about this. He says our cycle is, there's an event, there's sympathy towards the event, there's the pushback, and then we're back to where we were. And then we go through the cycle again. Event, sympathy about the event, pushback, and we're back to where we were. We never get anywhere because we never actually we label each other, we get angry at each other, And we actually never have the discussion we need to have, in which there are issues from both sides that need to be faced up to.
Speaking of issues from both sides, as we speak, the presidential debates are going on. And I, again, thank you for everybody for joining us tonight. But in your book, you write about the significance of character. Can you speak about the lack of character in our culture and what can or should we do about it?
For Christians, character is just about everything, because we are trying to make a case to the world that challenges the world on the way that it lives. But if our character is like that of the world, we have lost the credible ground to make the case that pushes against the flow if we aren't serious about demonstrating character. So this attempt to split policy from character, which 10 years ago we never would have done, is a problem for the church. Even though the policies that are being defended make sense from a Christian point of view, the danger is that it undercuts the credibility of the things where we're pushing hard against the world. And if the world comes to the view and comes to the conclusion, which could be credible, that says, well, you're really no different than this person, you just are defending something else. When we become a special interest group, like other special interest groups fighting in the same kind of way, then people will say, I'll pick the special interest group I want. But when you have character behind what you're doing, when there's a sincerity that's communicated to it, when you don't work against the rules or cheat or say, when it's our side, it's okay, but when it's their side, it's not. When you avoid those kinds of things and you build a credibility, you put yourself in the position to make the hard cases that we have to make in the public square. And so my fear is that by simply thinking about an ends justifies the means approach and not thinking about character, we've actually undercut one of the most important things that God gives us his Spirit for. And that is to make us into people whose character reflects the character of God not just in what we say, but even how we treat people. You know, God loved the sinner enough to send Jesus to the cross for the sinner. God reaches out to the sinner even when their back is turned to him. He's trying to reach out to them. Where do I see that in the way the church communicates with someone that I disagree with? Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to have conviction. I'm going to have conviction. I'm going to make the case. I'm going to do what I can, but I'm going to do it with integrity and I'm going to do it with character, because without that, the floor for my case allows my case to collapse, because they basically say, you're no different than anybody else.
But we live in a very messy world. I mean, this debate's messy.
Yep.
And living in this thing and trying to find some level of logic. So no, what do we do? What should we do? How do we react? What recommendations on your side? We need to remember the history of the church. In the chapter that I talked about, where I compare Paul to Romans 1 and then what he's doing in Acts 17, that grew out of a message that was originally entitled Back to the Future. And here's the point that I was making. The first century church had no political power. The first century church had no social power. But the first century church was effective in sharing the gospel. How could that be if they didn't have anything that the secular world or that our world today considers power? They did it on the depth of the character that they had as the community of the people of God. We need to really believe that it is possible to live that way, that we don't need the accoutrements of world power in order to maintain our credibility and to show who we are. In fact, oftentimes the Bible teaches it's out of our weakness that we are most powerful. And so if we can learn to be content in the solidity that our identity with God gives us, greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world. Okay, he's talking about those spiritual forces that are arrayed against us. Okay, greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world. And if we will be that community, we will show a different approach to life that throws everybody off, okay, who doesn't initially understand it, but it can be attractive because it stands out in so much contrast. At least it can be for many. Now, other people are not going to be interested, but our call is to be faithful
it's not necessarily I can't force someone else to be right. I like to tell people, stay in your pay grade. God's responsible for how people respond. Our call is to be faithful.
That's excellent. Dr. Bock, thank you for that. And I would like to open this thing up to some Q&A. So those that have got questions, please put them in on the question, the Q&A section on the board. As we're waiting for that, I continue to marvel at how relevant this topic is in today's at this particular time, with the civil unrest that we've got. Matter of fact, I mean, even the unrest we have on whether you wear a mask or not.
Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable that wearing a mask and protecting someone else's health could be controversial in the church. Okay. I might understand it outside in the world. I don't understand it in the church. I'm called to love people. I'm called to love God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength. I'm called to love my neighbor as myself. I worship a Savior who gave his life for the sake of others, who gave up his rights for the sake of others in the hopes that he could save some. And in the midst of that, if I can save one life by wearing a mask in the community that I'm a part of, it's worth it. And so the idea that this could be politicized to me is a symptom of evidence of a deeper problem in the church, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I understand, people want to have their choices and that kind of thing, but the wearing of a mask helps save lives and helps to curb the circulation of something that's dangerous to people. And so, for me to give up my rights in order for that to happen, to me as a Christian who's supposed to care about others, I think the politicization of the mask in our culture, and again, I'm an equal opportunity complainer here. I think everyone's politicized it. Okay, is a reflection, and then the church buying in is a reflection of how captured by the culture the church is in many ways.
Fascinating. One of the things that you go through in the decision-making process of things that are that you won't move on, things that are possible to move on, and things that need to be unpacked a little bit more. Can you walk through that decision-making piece as far as which decision fits in what bucket?
Okay, yeah, there are three buckets, okay? The first bucket is there really is a worldview difference. There's very little common ground. These are the hardest conversations because there's little common ground to go for. I say there are two issues that belong in that bucket. They are same-sex marriage and abortion. Now, there still is a Christian responsibility that you have to ask is, how am I going to relate to the person who thinks differently than me on this issue? And nothing says it more vividly than when a child in a family comes in and says, hey, I'm gay. Or as I've counseled people in my own office, this actually was the child of a pastor's wife. And this happened right after the Riggerfeld decision on same-sex marriage, in which the child came to the parents, declared themselves to be gay, said, I want to marry a same-sex partner, knew it was a problem for the pastor to officiate at the service, but asked if he would at least read scripture at the service. And the wife asked me, what should we do? To which my initial reaction was, you're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody. It's either going to be with your daughter, or it's going to be with your congregation, depending on how you sort through it. That is the fallen world. There is no good decision in that situation. Someone is going to be hurt, and someone's going to be misunderstand or risk being misunderstanding about what it is that you're doing and why. So that's category number one. But we never lose the relational level of what we're doing. That's an important part of everything that's happening in the book, is thinking through the relational level of what we do, even when we disagree. The second level is what I say is everyone's agreed on the goal. They just disagree on how to get there. Now, these are in some ways, they're still hard conversations, but they're not as hard because at least everyone shares the target. Okay. Now you ask the next question, how are we going to get there? You might get a million different views. So racial reconciliation is in this category. You go out and ask people on the street as a principle, should the races be reconciled? You'll get poll numbers that politicians would be jealous of getting. Okay. Be way up there. You ask the next question, how's this going to happen? Now you're into your debate, but at least there should be a recognition we're trying to get to the same place. So that's a little easier conversation. The bulk of our public discussions, particularly in public square politics, is a case where there are values colliding with each other, okay? And usually what's happening is one party has grasped one value and the other party has grasped the other value, and they've each planted their flag on that value. They don't recognize the conflict, or at least not enough, and so you never have the balancing conversation that our society absolutely needs to deal with the problem, because we've binaryized it. I'm coining a word here. I think binaryization is the danger of our culture. We've binaryized it in such a way that any move towards one another is seen as defection, when in fact, what you're actually trying to do is play with the balance in these issues. And if we would actually recognize that most issues have that dimension to them that we discuss in the public square, particularly related to politics, we might have better discussions with one another if we could recognize there is something that's being brought up here that is a part of this discussion and that needs to be brought into the view of the discussion as a whole, even if I value this idea a little more. So those are the three types of issues that we see in the public square. I think immigration is a classic example of this collision. Healthcare is another classic example of this collision. Although I talked about racial reconciliation in the second bucket, the aspect of justice and law and order is another example of an aspect of that discussion that belongs in the third bucket as well. So I just think if we think through, and then when I have the conversation, if I'm willing to listen enough to the other person to hear what it is that they're raising and to recognize at least some of the value of what it is that they're raising, I will have a different conversation than if my reaction is, no, I planted my flag and I can do no other.
In the book, you've got a constellation of 6 scriptures that you use as you set this up. And one of the things that I note when as we're going through that thing, there were 2 words that stuck in my mind. One was always, and the other one was everyone. As you go through that, can you relate a little bit as you were punctuating always and everyone?
Yeah, there really are 2 themes in that passage besides the whole battle thing that I've already did. One of the themes is tone, the idea of gentleness and meekness being in many of those passages. So let your speech always be seasoned with salt, always be gracious. It was and I make a point that always is a technical term. You go and look it up in the Bible and it means always. That's all the time, no exceptions. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 months out of the year, 365 days out of the year, 366 in leap years. You don't get to take a day off every 4 years, okay? Leap year doesn't mean, I can leap past that on that one day. It's always supposed to be seasoned with salt. Then another passage, Galatians 6:10, which says, do good to all men, especially to those of the faith. Now notice what that doesn't say, because we tend to read it this way. Do good to those of the faith, and everybody else, okay? That's not what that, do good to all men, especially those of the faith. So I'm supposed to treat everyone the same way, but I certainly should be treating fellow brothers and sisters in Christ in an appropriate manner. That doesn't lessen the way I'm supposed to treat other people, okay? It just says this certainly should be the case in this community, even though it's supposed to be the case all the way across the board. So that's always with everyone. That's the point of that passage.
It's got to catch us up short to really understand that. Always and everyone.
That's exactly right.
So you're in Houston. You're an Astros fan. You're an everything Houston fan.
Yep.
You're in the land of the Republicans.
Yep.
So as you're going through this thing, how is it that you resolve where you sit, where you stand, conversations around the dinner table with your friends? How does that feel?
Well, I have very good conversations with what I call my Bubba friends. They are deeply committed to doing the right thing. The people who are concerned about where the church is and where our society is, who are very conservative, for the most part, want to do the right thing in the conversations that I have. And they see this battle as kind of this dire struggle, to which my response is, you already have everything that you need to be secure in your relationship with God. That's the first thing that I say. And then I say, let's talk about what's bothering you, what has you concerned here. And then to my more liberal friends, I say, if I look at how you talk to my Bubba friends, not only do you not convince them, you actually drive them more to the right. And I say to my conservative friends, if you look at how you talk to my more liberal friends, not only do you not convince them, you drive them more to the left. And the reason that happens is because of the binaryizing with which we have the conversation. What I'm trying to do with both sides is to say, let's knock down the binaries. Let's recognize that each of us, and this is particularly true with people of the faith, let's recognize that each of us is sharing concerns that are legitimate. And then let's talk about how to balance those concerns, or what that balance should look like, and what we should be concerned about in trying to do this. In the book that I wrote 4 years ago, before I even knew who was running, the book on How Would Jesus Vote, I went through probably a dozen different issues where I tried to show this. The trouble was I wrote that book too early. I didn't have the template that I now have to assess those issues in the way that I assess it now. And so you can see the principles that I'm talking about in that book. It's just not as clear as it is to me now about how to discuss those issues.
That's wonderful. Okay, let's head over to the questions.
Okay.
Let me take the first one. Can you please speak to the curious attachment many Christians have with patriotism and their faith Americanism?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm doing a conference for the Evangelical Homiletical Society in the next few weeks, and I've actually spoken to this, that the idea that what I call our nationalism it's a problem, because what happens is it becomes more important to be American than it is to be Christian. Why do I say that? The Christian movement is designed to be transnational. If you read the book of Revelation, we go to heaven, there's not going to be a section reserved for Americans. Okay? We're all going to be mixed together. People of every tribe and every nation are going to get up and talk about the worship that they share of the living God. And so when our Americanism becomes more important than our Christianity, because I want to elevate my country at the expense of people who live in other countries, including Christians who live in other countries, I'm out of balance biblically. So I think we have to think about the national nature of what it is that we do and who it is that we are to be, and the way in which we work on that. So I think the danger of patriotism is that it becomes more important to be a citizen of America than it is to be a citizen of heaven. And I think we always have to watch that. And by the way, it's okay to be critical of your nation. I like to use the prophets as the example. The prophets were as pro-Israel as anyone, but they could be as self-critical about where their nation was as anyone. We can't lose that principle of being able to be self-critical about where we are.
That's good. I'm going to do the next one, and I'm going to start with the end. I'm a discouraged Christian mom. What encouragement do you have for me? I have a son who came of age as an adult during the last presidential election. God has gifted him with a deep sense of compassion for marginalized people. Unfortunately, in his estimation, the church and Christians seem to him to be the least compassionate and unlike Christ in their political views. He's left the church, remains ambiguous about Christianity, and has a very critical and disenfranchised with his previous vibrant Christian community. Discouraged Christian mom.
That's sad. That's actually happening all over the country. If you look at what is happening with young people, they are becoming disenchanted with the church, many of them, for this very reason. It's part of the reason I'm speaking out, because I actually think that on this particular point, they have a point that we need to take seriously. The only way you're going to begin to think about recovering your son in this regard is to acknowledge the failure of the church. You know, in biblical Christianity, repentance is not a bad idea. It's not a dirty word. To recognize where we come up short, to acknowledge it, and to begin to do the work of changing the direction of how we go about things. Remember, I made the point, you can be right about your idea and wrong about how you relate on it. You're still wrong. That's what this son is sensing. There's something wrong about the way that we're doing this. It doesn't reflect Christian values the way it ought to. So I think it's I understand the discouragement. I understand what it is for someone to distance the church. I see it going on with young people all over the place. I see good Christians who are still very connected to the church, who are very worried about how the church treats other people at the same time.
That's good. Okay, here's another one. Can you talk me off the ledge of demonizing people who don't think like we think?
This is the delusion thing. Okay. Understand what's really going on. Okay. The problem is not just the person. The problem is the spiritual influences on the person. Now, there are people who are so dug in to thinking differently, that's going to be a hard thing to do. I'm really interested in the people who aren't unreasonable, okay, who are willing to have these conversations from outside the faith, who are willing to think about the issues as we talk about them. But you never want to demonize someone because you never know who might be persuadable. I dare say that most of the church in its earliest years would have said, the last person who's ever going to become a Christian is Saul, the Pharisee. Look what happened to him. Now, that wasn't done through a campaign of people doing their thing, or at least we don't think so. But when Jesus appeared to him in that vision, he had to have understood and processed what it was the apostles were teaching in order to appreciate what Jesus' appearance meant. So there were seeds planted, even though he was trying to kill the people who were trying to plant those seeds. So you talk people off the ledge of demonizing people by thinking about what people can become if they have an encounter with God, which you're supposed to represent them having the possibility of having that encounter, than if you think about where they are currently. And if you see this rescue mode that we're talking about, the GIA that I talked about earlier, that helps you to get there. That helps you to think about, when I preach this, I use the old Mission Impossible thing. Your assignment, should you choose to accept it. And I talk about what the assignment of the GIA is. And I say, and this tape will not self-destruct in 5 seconds. It will be with you always, so.
Oh, that's good. Okay, the next one we've got is people are passionate politically. How can I or we have Jesus in those conversations? How can I verbalize Jesus's example in a loving way?
Sometimes I think it's important not to worry about verbalizing it, but showing it. If you show it enough, if you treat people in a way they don't expect to be treated, or you treat people in a way that's different than most of the way the world treats people who disagree with them, at some point the person's going to go, why are you different? What makes the difference? That's your door. So sometimes I think we have to say, we tell ourselves, we have to say it. Now, sometimes you can just show. In fact, Jesus in his own ministry spent a lot of time showing who he was rather than going around bragging that he was the Messiah. He would do things that show the compassion. And the thing that haunts me is, how is it that marginalized people sensed from Jesus he was approachable? What made them attractive to him? And here's another thought that really bothers me, and that is, how is it that Jesus was harshest for the people who claim to know better? Jesus is harshest with the Pharisees who claim to really know God and to represent God well. And he basically said to them, you're not even close. But when it came to the marginalized, there was this sense that there was this offer of forgiveness that he brought that could take them out of the trap in which they found themselves. And they were attracted by that. That nature of Jesus's own ministry, I've spent my life in the Gospels, haunts me in terms of thinking about engagement.
Here's the next one. How should, quote, showing respect be defined? What is respectful? How do we achieve the perspective that disagreeing is not disrespectful? How do we disarm tendencies toward defensiveness?
Okay, this is extremely important. This is a great question. When I'm in a conversation, I have to understand the difference between trying to understand where someone is coming from and accepting where they are coming from. Most people conflate those two things, okay? My first goal in a difficult conversation is to make sure I understand where the other person is coming from and why. Not to impute motive to them, okay? But to actually try, I call it getting a spiritual GPS reading on someone. It usually involves asking a lot of questions as opposed to making statements. And you're just trying to dig what's underneath there, what's driving them, what concerns do they have? Have they had a bad experience with the church in the past? Just go through the list of what the possibilities are. And what you're doing is you're drawing them out and you're letting them speak and you're respecting them by taking the time to listen to their story. And then when they respond to you, you're not responding in rebuttal. Okay, I tell people you need to put your doctrinal meter on mute in a difficult conversation. Don't turn it off, okay, because you still have it and you need to have it, but put it on mute. And the way you can tell whether you're listening to somebody or not is when they're responding to you, are you forming your rebuttal? Or are you interested in responding to them in such a way, let me put this in different words, what you've said, and see if I get what you're saying. And when you do that, you're trying to understand them. You're not necessarily accepting what they say. You're just trying to understand what they're coming from. That's a distinction that's very important in a conversation. And if you develop that ability, then the idea of the conversation won't threaten you because you'll know how to approach the conversation. And then in the midst of that, you can get down and then you move to assessment. That's what I call the acceptance part. You move to assessment once you've laid out, yeah, we really do understand each other. When they're able to say to you, you know, you get what I'm saying. Okay, now let's assess what it is that's been said. And you go and you get into that harder part of the conversation. But in the meantime, you've communicated a respect of listening to the person to get there.
That's great. The next question, what are some big mistakes Christians make in making abortion, what are some big mistakes Christians make in making the abortion subject the premier deal maker in politics?
Because there's more to pro-life than abortion. What you often hear from people in this conversation who push back is, you care about life in the womb, but once someone's born, you really don't care how they live. You know, that the idea, the people who are pro-abortion but don't care about justice, okay? Or the people who only care about justice in a certain way without recognizing the past. That's an imbalance. Those are both pro-life. Both of the idea that people who are made in the image of God should be respected as human beings, regardless of their race, okay? And particularly with races that have previously been regarded as not being equal to other people. That's why I talk about the Black Lives Matter phrase a lot, because the way I like to say it, Black Lives Matter to God, okay? Black Lives Matter to God. So does everybody else, but Black Lives matter to God. Why do they matter to God? Because a Black person is made in the image of God just like a white person is. And and when we fail, when we push back to Black Lives Matter by saying all lives matter, what you've just said to someone whose historical experience as a race has been, we haven't counted fully. I mean, we're even 3/5 in the Constitution. You know, that it communicates an insensitivity to where that comment is coming from. Okay. And I'm going to distinguish in this conversation. This is where balance comes in. I'm going to distinguish in that conversation between the slogan and what it means and the organization and what they represent. I'm going to learn how to sort out that difference as well, because that's also part of the conversation. What I'm saying to you is there are layers in these conversations that go beyond the labels, and we have to be able to parse the layers. We have to sort through the layers because that's part of the balancing act. that you're in these conversations. If you can do that respectfully with one another, you can have a different kind of conversation.
That's great. Here's the next question. I'm a white male. Shouldn't I just be quiet in the public market space and look for one-to-one conversations to be salt or light, or a pebble in a shoe?
Yes, you can, although I do think there are times in which you have to speak up. We have to speak up for the balance of what is necessary here. One of the dangers coming at us from the left is a use of identity politics in such a way that it actually reverses the very discrimination they complained about when it was coming from the other direction. Okay? So one of the dangers, and we see this in our society, one of the dangers of a power shift is that the power was stacked one way, and in the shift, what happens is the positions reverse. Okay? Or at least there's the risk of that happening. So sometimes it's a point to say, if someone's saying to you, well, you're white, so you can't say anything. Wait a minute. I'm a human being, just like you are. This is a time to have a discussion. And don't blame me because of my whiteness. I am here to listen, okay, to what you're saying to me as a white person. But as a white person, there are things I can say to you that might help both of us, okay? And you have to work at that, because some people today aren't interested in going there. But in general, the point is well taken, that what you want to look for are the kinds of conversations where the opportunity exists to have a conversation. But then the other important point here is that there are things we do in the difficult conversations that can cause it to break down that we need to avoid in order to have good conversations. And one of those principles in the book is I don't shy back from my convictions. I tell people where I am just like they're trying to tell me where they're coming from. And I ask for an attempt to mutually respect that. If I respect where someone else is coming from who disagrees with me, I hope they'll do the same thing back. You're trying to break the dysfunction of what happens in conversations as you pursue difficult conversations.
Next question. I'm afraid that we are losing the young people who are very strong in supporting gay issues, immigration, and such modern challenges. How can we win them for biblical principles as they are specifically influenced by the media?
Okay, again, don't binaryize the discussion. And this, don't binaryize the discussion. There are things that are being raised that need our attention. I'm in the middle of all kinds of discussions on race in our city. And what I say to people who are pushing back, particularly the people who are coming at it from the right because they're genuinely concerned about law and order issues, which are perfectly appropriate to raise, is to say, this topic, even liberals have put their finger on something that needs attention, even by Christians. What is it? What is it we should be looking for? Don't treat it as if it's all fake news, okay? Don't treat it as if it's all, that's coming at it from the right, from the left. Don't treat it as if the concern for law and order is misguided, okay? But again, let's think about how to balance it. Both these elements have value, okay? But to balance these elements makes for a better society. So let's figure out how to have that discussion in the midst of what it is. That's going to mean change. That's going to mean change on both ends, okay? The great tragedy of where we are today is that we've lost the middle. We've lost the middle.
Good. Can you talk about righteous anger? I hear many, especially young believers, say, well, Jesus was angry, as a reason for their pressing their point in disrespectful ways. How are Christians misrepresenting Jesus's anger?
Well, first of all, Jesus has a better truth meter than I do. So that's the first thing to remember, that he has the right to be angry. But the other thing is, look at what made Jesus angry. And as I said to you earlier, what made Jesus angry was the people who should know better should do better. This is one of my complaints against the way the church has interacted culturally, because we're supposed to be the ones who know better. When we act like the way the world acts, okay, we cede that ground, okay? when we're angry in the way that the world is angry, and not with the right kind of caring, righteous anger, because I think righteous anger has to be caring or else it doesn't work. James 1, one of my favorite verses is James 1, 19 and 20. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, and quick to listen. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. So you want, there are times to be righteously angry. You're not supposed to let the sun go down on your anger. You're not supposed to let your anger boil overnight, if I can say it that way. So yes, Jesus did get angry. He got angry at some very interesting things. He got angry at injustice. He got angry at inconsistency. He got angry at a lack of character. He got angry for claiming something in God's name that doesn't represent what God means and does well. Those are the things Jesus got angry about. And then what he tried to do to people who are living in the world and trapped by the world was to draw them to God.
Let's see this one. I'm a leader of an immigrant church. And it's hard to talk to the congregations about the local and their local office, about their local candidates. Everything is not measured by God's word.
Who is for us and against us?
Are there any winning approaches for this?
Hard to do. This is why the parsing and the slow thinking is necessary. Because what you want to wrestle with is, what is it? You want to ask yourself, what is it that's driving this candidate? Are there things driving this candidate that are positive? Are there things driving this candidate that's negative? And you especially want to do it carefully with the person you disagree with, because you're already in alignment with the person you agree with, and for reasons that probably explain where you are. But what we tend to do with the person who we disagree with, this is why I talk about not talking about motive when you're in difficult discussions, when you're trying to read someone else and the motive is usually negative. Okay, and what I'm trying to say to the person is, that if you think negatively about someone and try and be a prophet about why they're doing what they're doing, most of us don't have that gift, and we risk misreading them. So what you want to do is you want to think about what is potentially positive. I'll say it this way. What is potentially positive and what is motivating them to say these things? And to try and, again, first gain understanding about what it is the person is doing and coming from, then do your assessment. Now, after your assessment's over, you may still say, you know what? I can't agree with that. It violates this principle or that principle. But the way you've gone about that discussion is as important as the conclusion that you come to. And most of us rush to judgment.
Let's see. Right now, this is the last question. Speak to the oneness of the diverse believers for which Jesus prayed that will show the world that he is divine.
Oh, this is a wonderful question, because I think this is the challenge of the church today in the midst of the variety of views that we're talking about. Part of the reason I'm spending so much time talking about this and talking about the loss of the middle is I'm trying to recover the middle for the sake of the unity of the church. And so I'm trying to say to people, when you sit next, think about this. There are people who have sat next to one another for years in church who today can barely talk to one another because of politics. How in the world does that happen? So what I'm trying to say is this way of thinking about engaging in winsome conversations in which my first goal is to try and understand where someone else is coming from and then move to assessment and be engaged in slow and in some cases mutual thinking is a much better way to have these conversations than simply planting my flag and saying, here I stand, I can do no other, when the other person is planting their flag and they're saying, here I stand and I can do no other. That's gridlock. And we're watching what that happens. When you binaryize these discussions in the ways in which we are doing it right now by negating values that need to be taken into consideration, you do not help our societal discourse.
That's great. Thank you, Darrell. Thank you for the questions. A couple pieces. we're going to offer this book as a complimentary gift for any donations that we receive over $100 from this event. There is a gift button on our website, or you can text Corban, C-O-R-B-A-N, to 21000, 21,000. So we've got, while supplies last, this will be a gift to our gift from us.
I think I've signed those books.
These are signed. They are signed. As a matter of fact, I'll show you what the signature looks like right there.
There you go. Yep.
That was, thanks for signing those books.
Yeah.
Dr. Bock, could you give us a taste of tomorrow night? You're going to be talking on the Good Samaritan. It's at 8 o'clock. You can register again on our website, but could you give us a taste of what we have in store for tomorrow evening?
Well, I love this passage because Jesus gives an answer we don't expect to a question we ask all the time. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And he starts off by citing the great commandment. So I'm going to answer the question, why does he answer that question that way? And then from there, I'm going to ask the question, so what is it Jesus calls us to be as people who are responsive to God? And the question is, do I think about my neighbor and who they are, or do I think about who I am as a neighbor? I'm going to discuss that question tomorrow as well.
Well, we are looking forward to tomorrow. We encourage everybody to attend, and thank you for all the participants. And Dr. Bock, it has been our pleasure to spend the evening with you. You are such a blessing.
Oh, well, you're kind. And my prayer is that the work that you all do at Corban, and I'm familiar, I've been out there before, is really great. I mean, these schools that are designed to encourage young people to walk with God are really important in our time. And we want to just not walk with God, we want to walk well with God. That's what I'm hoping we're able to do.
Well, thank you. And everybody, good night.